Hello everyone, welcome back. This is part 3. Lee and Grant. Right now it's about Lee. I have some barbecue chicken pizza, so I'm going to snack on that while I'm watching the video, and we're all going to have fun. Part 3 begins now.
Lee and the army advanced deep into enemy territory towards Parras to support General Worth in Saltillo and arrived 2 days before Christmas. Lee led a scouting mission to determine the position of the Mexican army and was quite determined in his pursuit. His tenacity impressed General Wool, who made Lee his acting inspector general. Lee would learn that being persistent whilst carrying out reconnaissance paid off, and also to not take exaggerated reports seriously. General Wool was ordered to join up with General Taylor in Buena Vista to support him against Santa Anna, where Santa Anna was routed by a force of 5,000 Americans against his 14,000 Mexican force. Lee left to join General Scott on the 17th of January 1847, and upon his arrival was accepted into Scott's general staff and inner circle. Lee was quartered on the flagship USS Massachusetts, sharing his room with former West Point classmate Joseph E. Johnston. In total, 12,000 men would be under General Scott's command for the invasion of Veracruz.
Do you remember how you loved cereal as a kid? Would you like to live those days again? You can now with Magic Spoon. It's a tasty, nutritious cereal in delicious flavors like blueberry, cinnamon, maple waffle, and even cookies and cream.
I have some.
The fleet sailed to the Lobos Islands to rendezvous. With the rest of their forces, but were delayed due to smallpox outbreaks and a vicious storm. The fleet left on the 3rd of March and arrived in Veracruz on the 5th of March, where Lee first saw the imposing island fortress of San Juan de Ulua, which guarded the city. Lee boarded the Patrita along with General Scott to survey the beaches, but the ship strayed too close to the fort, leading to an opening salvo from the fortress. This was the first time in Lee's 22-year-long military career that he had been under fire. On the 9th of March, 2,595 soldiers went
22 years before he was opened fired upon. Wow. Well, he didn't necessarily join to seek out war, so yeah, that makes sense. And we weren't really fighting anyone. Kind of some peace, so yeah.
To shore with no resistance from the Mexican army, and during the night of the 22nd of March, the American mortars opened fire. By the 27th of March, Veracruz had fallen to the Americans. Lee's first taste of battle would leave him disheartened, as he would write to Mary that, "It was awful. My heart bled for the inhabitants. The soldiers I did not care so much for, but it was terrible to think of the women and children." Lee never had a love for glory for his own sake, and his first battle left him melancholy. General Scott then looked to Mexico City, which was 280 miles away, but his supply lines would be stretched thin. The United States Army had no intelligence concerning where Santa Anna's army was located, let alone their size. Santa Anna had returned to Mexico City following his defeat at Buena Vista and raised a new force of 12,000. General Scott left Veracruz with 6,000 troops and found Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo, where he held an imposing defensive position. Following a reconnaissance mission, Lee informed General Scott there was a potential pathway they could cut to the extreme left flank of Santa Anna's line without them knowing. Scott agreed and gave Lee the opportunity to guide a division to the Mexican army and commence the battle on the 18th of April. In preparation for the assault, the soldiers started scaling the hill on the 17th of April, but they made too much noise and alerted the Mexican army, who started advancing down the hill. They countercharged up the hill, pushing the Mexican army back before finally establishing a hold on the summit of La Atalaya. Ultimately, the Mexicans were defeated at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, and the Americans only suffered minor casualties in comparison to the Mexican army. Lee's actions at the Battle of Cerro Gordo earned him a promotion to brevet major and praise from all of his superiors. Lee would leave with Scott, along with Lieutenants P.G.T. Beauregard and George B. McClellan, towards Mexico City. Following a small engagement at Molina del Rey, the army was now in position to assault Chapultepec, an important fortress, as it overlooked Mexico City, which would allow for continuous assaults. As the senior engineer, Lee argued against a direct assault on the fortress, but Lee was overruled and led Pillow's division to the west flank of Chapultepec. The first assault was pushed back, but the second assault was successful, with Lee climbing the slope accompanied by Lieutenants James Longstreet and George Pickett. Lee was injured during the assault, but was able to help General Pillow away from the battle. Following the fall of Chapultepec, nearly all Mexican resistance collapsed, but Mexico City wouldn't be fully pacified until 2 days later due to Santa Anna releasing armed criminals from the local prison. It was a solemn peace, as many Americans believed they had bullied Mexico throughout the war. Lee would be promoted to brevet colonel for his actions at Chapultepec and eventually returned home on the 29th of June 1848. It took roughly 32 years from the time he started as a cadet at West Point for Lee to rise to brevet colonel, and in comparison to other officers of the time, he advanced only slightly faster than the average officer. While Lee would not receive a proper promotion, he was elevated to serve as the superintendent of West Point in 1852, a major accomplishment and a compliment to his teaching abilities. Although Lee was not thrilled at the prospect, as he unusually complained to his friend P.G.T. Beauregard that there was an impossibility of either giving or receiving satisfaction from overseeing West Point. Nonetheless, he worked hard bettering the cavalry school by lobbying for new stables and a practice ring. It is also possible that Lee designed the new facilities himself, as they were very similar to the stables at Lee's home in Arlington. Under
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Lee's guidance, West Point produced the finest cavalry officers of the era. He cared about the well-being of the cadets, but he could not coddle them, or else they would prove to be poor officers. West Point cadets were notorious for their high jinks along with their rowdiness and undisciplined behavior. As a result, Lee would turn towards corporal punishment, demerits, and the worst of cases, the expulsion of the cadet from the academy to maintain discipline. Those who did not possess the skills needed to become an officer were allowed to resign. Despite Lee's doubling down on disciplinary measures, the problems plaguing West Point were still not fixed during his 2.5-year tenure. Lee received his first true promotion in March of 1855, when Secretary of War Jefferson Davis offered Lee a lieutenant colonel post in the 2nd Cavalry. This promotion would come at the cost of Lee's position in the Corps of Engineers, and also meant he had to leave his family behind. Whilst Lee had longed for the opportunity to leave the Corps of Engineers, his time in Texas would be unpleasant. A series of personal tragedies befell him, as both his mother-in-law and his sister Mildred died. A little over a year later, his father-in-law George Custis died in October of 1857. He was the only father figure in his life, and now he was gone. Not only did he lose family members, but he lost his favorite mare, who ran off with a wild horse. After his father-in-law's death, Lee returned to Arlington to settle the affairs of Custis' estate.
The man had 7 layers of shit happen to him. Like almost at one time, didn't he? Wow. That sucks.
Which were in disarray due to years of neglect. Custis left his 196 slaves to their own devices towards the end of his life, only expecting them to cultivate their own personal gardens to grow their food. The change in ownership brought uncertainty, as they had no control over their destiny. Lee would invest a large sum of money into the estates to upgrade the living quarters for the slaves, partially quote, to do what is right and best for the people, but also because he needed their labor to make a profit to settle the debts Custis had left. As a result, Lee unintentionally caused disquiet amongst the slaves when he began hiring out slaves to other plantations without communicating how long they would be gone. The slave community at Arlington had been together since their time at Mount Vernon, as they had been allowed to stay together, unlike other slaves whose families had been broken up. Custis Will did free his slaves, as he was a member of the American Colonization Society. However, Lee made use of a provision which allowed him to retain them until the debt had been paid. As a result, the slaves began to test Lee's resolve to keep them on the plantation, sometimes in open rebellion. They asserted they were legally as free as Lee was, yet they had almost no legal grounds to declare their freedom. Some of those who attempted to test Lee were Wesley Norris, his sister Mary, and their cousin George Parks, who ran away from the plantation in late spring of 1859. They were eventually captured and brought back to Arlington. Accounts of their punishment spread in excruciating detail in the abolitionist papers, which would sometimes greatly exaggerate the accounts to generate attention. This does not mean the punishments such as whipping, which Norris received, were not true, as Lee and other witnesses do corroborate the general accounts of the event, but they disagree with the exact details. Norris claimed that Lee personally whipped him and the other slaves as punishment, yet a man of Lee's standing in Southern society would never have doled out punishment himself.
I don't think he did. I'm not basing that on anything other than I don't see him as a type of person that would punish someone like that, slave or not. I think the type of punishments that he doled out would have been, for them, maybe increased production. But I'm not now. I could see him ordering someone to whip a slave, but I don't think he himself would have done that. I also don't think that he was one of those people that enjoyed that. Some did. I don't think he was one of them. I think he was. I think he was more grounded than that.
It would have been a blotch on Lee's social standing if he personally dealt the punishment, which may have been the reason behind the accusation. On the 17th of October 1859, J.E.B. Stewart, otherwise known as Jeb Stuart, rode to Arlington requesting Lee attend the War Department immediately. Lee immediately left with Stuart, entering into a meeting with President James Buchanan, along with several cabinet members. John Brown, an abolitionist, and 18 other men had just taken a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, killing a few civilians and taking hostages. Lee and Stuart were both sent via a special train to take control of the situation from the local militia, who corralled Brown's forces in the engine house of the arsenal. When Brown refused to surrender, the Marines sent with Lee stormed the engine house, leaving one Marine and 2 of Brown's freedom fighters dead. Lee would dismiss Brown's attempted revolution as the attempt of a fanatic or a madman that could only end in failure. Lee, along with many other future major players such as Thomas Jackson, Edmund Ruffin, and John Wilkes Booth, would watch Brown's execution. Unknown to Lee, Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, had lit the fuse for the events of the next 5 years. Following the events in Harper's Ferry, Lee was asked to return to Texas in February of 1860. Many Southerners were relieved of their posts due to the increased talks of secession by Southern state representatives. Lee was appalled at the idea of deconstructing the country and saw it as anarchy. Yet Lee, like many others, would choose to side with whatever path their state would take. Americans had a sense of responsibility to family and state over the nation as a whole, which played a significant role in the coming conflict. He swore to never take arms against the United States, but if Virginia left the Union, he would give his life to defend her. Ultimately, the choice would be left to a statewide convention, but its decision would not be made soon. On the 13th of March, 1861, Lee attended a reception for military officers at the White House, where he met with Abraham Lincoln for the first and only time. President Lincoln knew of Lee's uncertain allegiance and hoped to maintain Lee within the Union. He offered him the position of colonel in the 1st Regiment of Cavalry, a position Lee could not afford to turn down. Yet peace would become unattainable in early April when Lincoln decided to resupply Fort Sumter, which was being blockaded by rebel forces under the direction of P.G.T. Beauregard. General Beauregard gave the order to fire on Fort Sumter on the 12th of April 1861, and Edmund Ruffins is credited with firing the first shots of the war. Fort Sumter would fall on the 14th of April 1861, and Lee underwent intense questioning from General Scott, requesting he either side with the Union or resign his commission.
We're going to leave it right there on a cliffhanger. What's he going to do? To be honest, this isn't something that's really talked about very often. He can either side with the Union or side with the Confederacy. What people don't know is that I believe he bought a one-way ticket to Madagascar. Had nothing to do with the war. I could be wrong, and we're going to find out in the next episode of Robert E. Lee. What did he do? And then there's a question mark. So like and subscribe, or I won't do the next video. I'm going to do the next video anyways, but you know. All right. Damn. 49ers are up 23-17 with 4:06 left in the third quarter. And by the time this comes out, it'll probably be Super Bowl weekend. People won't give a shit. But anyways, I'm going to end it here. Bye-bye.